What happened on this street in the town of Ponce was one of the most brutal ways in which the US government tried to silence the pro-independence movement in Puerto Rico. What was supposed to be a peaceful march ended up with guards killing 19 people and injuring more than 200.
Yo vi tirar a la policía, porque ellos le dispararon a la gente que estaban en la acera.
It also served to send a message to anyone who aligned with the Nationalist Party.
Puerto Rico, the island has prospered under U.S. rule, but a tiny extremist party committed to violence occasionally erupts in anti-U.S. outbursts.
There was a persecution of pro-independence people.
Independence is the solution.
¿Por qué se nos ataca tanto por decir que nosotros queremos que Puerto Rico sea una nación libre?
La libertad.
El gran milagro es que existan independentistas.
This video is the first in a series of 3 where I'm going to be talking about Puerto Rico's status. And I'm starting with the least popular option, independence. Today, only a minority of Puerto Ricans vote in favor of Puerto Rico being fully independent from the US. But those who do support that option say that's because for many years the US government persecuted, imprisoned, and even killed supporters of independence. And perhaps there's no better way to understand that history than to look at the life of the father of the Puerto Rican independence movement, Pedro Albiso Campos. Albiso was a child when the US invaded Puerto Rico in 1898. He saw troops march in his town of Ponce. He was a gifted student and he went on to study law at Harvard. And then came World War I, when the US military was segregated. Being a dark-skinned Puerto Rican, he served in an African-American unit where he would be exposed to racism in the US. That experience would play a part in shaping his attitude towards the United States. After the military, he returned to Harvard, and there he worked with and was inspired by leaders fighting for independence for their own countries. After he got his law degree, Albiso turned down offers like working for the US Supreme Court. Instead, he chose to return to Puerto Rico. He joined the independence movement and he was vocal about his support for taking up arms to free Puerto Rico. One of the reasons Albiso believed Puerto Rico needed independence was because of the damage that US corporate interests were causing. Sugar companies were taking up land and keeping workers in poverty by paying them some 60 cents a day for 12-hour shifts. Here's a speech Albiso gave to workers.
Los yanquis, malos como son, egoístas como son, si encontraran oro en los huesos de nosotros, nos molerían en sus centrales azucareras.
In 1934, Albiso led the workers on an island-wide strike and won, forcing the U.S. sugar companies to pay the workers more. That gained him support with Puerto Ricans, but it also gained him some enemies from the U.S., and things turned violent the following year.
La policía insular, bajo el mando del gobierno de Estados Unidos, masacró a 4 jóvenes nacionalistas.
In 1935, U.S. police officers killed 3 nationalists who were sitting in a car and a 4th one who came to their defense. No officers were charged in those killings. That came to be known as the Rio Piedras Massacre. And the following year, nationalists retaliated. 2 men killed the US-appointed police chief. They were arrested and executed at the police headquarters without a trial. Albiso publicly called them martyrs and heroes, and he was arrested shortly after for sedition, or for inciting people to rebel against the US government. Albiso went to trial, and a jury of mostly Puerto Ricans found him not guilty, so the judge ordered a new trial with a new jury, and this time 10 jurors from the US and only 2 Puerto Ricans found him guilty. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. This brings us to 1937, the year that the Bunsen Massacre happened. The museum that tells the story of this massacre is now closed because it was damaged during an earthquake. But that building used to be the nationalist headquarters in Ponce. And that's where that peaceful march I told you at the beginning of this video was taking place. And it was in part to protest Albiso's arrest. Well, when the US government heard it was taking place, they ordered police to stop it. The guards showed up heavily armed and they started shooting at the crowd. Among the people they killed was a 14-year-old girl. An investigation by the federal government found that the US-appointed governor was to blame for the massacre, but no one was ever arrested or charged for the murders. The governor didn't even apologize. This is a picture of the relatives of the victims. You can see the wall behind them is covered in bullet holes. Some 10 years later, Albiso was free again, and the government passed a law to further silence nationalists. They made it illegal for people to write about, talk about, or organize to try to take down the US government. But the nationalists carried on planning an armed revolution to free Puerto Rico. In 1950, they carried out a series of attacks. They led revolts in different towns. They attacked the governor's mansion and even tried to assassinate President Harry Truman in D.C.
Extreme fanatics of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party try to force their way in, guns blazing, to assassinate the President of the United States.
They were unsuccessful and had to surrender after the United States used military force and killed almost 30 nationalists. Hundreds were arrested, and Albiso was sentenced to 80 years in prison for masterminding the uprising. In the US, the whole thing was mostly reported as an incident among Puerto Ricans. So a few years later, the nationalists decided it was time to embarrass the US internationally, and they attacked Congress.
In Washington, D.C., ruthless, fanatic violence erupted in the halls of Congress.
4 nationalists fired shots in the House of Representatives and displayed the Puerto Rican flag. No one was killed, but 5 congressmen were injured.
The gun wielders, and to their accomplices goes the evil distinction of having perpetrated a criminal outrage almost unique in America's history.
This is Rafael Cancel Miranda, one of the shooters when he was in his 80s.
Si tuviera que hacerlo, volvería a hacer. Nos asesinan democráticamente, pero tú no puedes levantarle la vista porque estás cometiendo un acto de terror. Tú sabes, no. Tenemos derecho a pelear para atrás.
When she was arrested, Lolita Lebrón said she didn't go to kill anyone, but to die for Puerto Rico. Those words would inspire Oscar López Rivera.
Me puso como a cuestionarme allí mismo, ¿qué vas a hacer tú si una mujer puertorriqueña está dispuesta a dar su vida por Puerto Rico? ¿Y tú, que eres puertorriqueño, qué vas a hacer?
Similar to Albiso, Oscar says his disillusion with the US government started when he joined the military.
Es Vietnam donde yo aprendo lo que es Estados Unidos.
He says he didn't want to go to war, but at this point Puerto Ricans were US citizens and he was drafted.
En esa carta había un mensaje, decía: si no te reportas al centro de inducción en la fecha indicada, puedes enfrentar hasta 5 años de prisión federal. Yo tenía 22 años y lo menos que yo iba a hacer era ir a una prisión. La opción entonces era prestar servicio militar obligatorio.
Oscar says he saw his friends die in Vietnam.
Cuando dieron el reporte, le habían metido 35 balas a ese compañero, porque él cayó de rodillas. Ya ahí automáticamente es cuando uno comienza a tener una apreciación de lo que está pasando y hace que uno piense en las vidas que se pierden. En otras palabras, somos dispensables, somos seres que, no contamos para nada.
He came back from war as a hero, and he received the Bronze Star for his service. But years later, he would be labeled a terrorist. Oscar joined a group that also believed in taking up arms to fight for Puerto Rico's independence. U.S. prosecutors accused this group of carrying out more than 100 bomb attacks, including one in New York City that killed 4 people. But Oscar says he never killed anyone.
Si hay un pequeñito, un pelo que haya de que yo participé de esa actividad, entonces tú me puedes declarar terrorista. Tú me puedes declarar terrorista, pero si no, no me puedes declarar terrorista porque yo no cometí ese crimen.
Prosecutors couldn't link him to any deaths, but they did charge him with plotting to overthrow the U.S. government after they arrested him during a traffic stop.
Agarra ahí un bolso a la parte de atrás del carro, un backpack, y lo abre y ahí hay una pistola. Entonces él grita al otro policía, el otro policía viene y ahí es que nos arrestan.
He spent more than 35 years in prison, including 12 in solitary confinement. But he did not change his mind about Puerto Rico.
Yo creo que Puerto Rico tiene el potencial para ser una nación libre y soberana. Yo no tengo la menor duda de eso.
¿Cuáles son los pros de independencia para Puerto Rico?
Primero, la posibilidad de mandar nosotras en nuestra propia casa.
María Lourdes Santiago is one of the leaders of the Puerto Rican Independence Party. The party has been around since the 40s, and in the 50s, it got as much as 20% of the vote, making it the second largest party in Puerto Rico. But that number has been shrinking ever since, hitting 2% in 2016. And when asked the question of Puerto Rico's status, no more than 6% of Puerto Ricans choose independence. Senator Santiago blames the government's persecution of independence supporters.
Durante décadas, la policía de Puerto Rico, en contubernio con el gobierno federal, mantuvo expedientes criminales. Había un piso completo del cuartel general dedicado a documentar las actividades de los independentistas, como si era una reunión del Partido Independentista o de cualquier otra agrupación. Fuera algo que ameritara un castigo.
She's talking about the Carpetas. For decades, the FBI kept secret files on people who did as much as go to a meeting about independence. These secret files were called Carpetas, and the people who had them were often denied jobs and blacklisted.
Para mi papá fue un choque tan duro que mi hermana y yo resultáramos ser independentistas porque eso anticipaba una vida más difícil.
But with a new generation, that stigma attached to the Independence Party might be dissolving. In 2020, Senator Santiago was the candidate who got the most votes to be elected to the Puerto Rico Senate. But some would argue that voting for a candidate from the Independence Party is not the same as voting for independence for Puerto Rico. And it gets even more confusing if you mix in US politics. Some Republicans don't want Puerto Rico to be a state because it has billions of dollars in debt and because Puerto Ricans speak Spanish. And some Democrats do want Puerto Rico to be a state because they believe that Congress members from here would be Democrats, therefore giving them more power. But they also say that would finally give Puerto Rico voting representation in Congress. Senator Santiago says, no thank you.
Asumir que lo mejor que le puede pasar a un pueblo es asimilarse a otro, es en el fondo, aunque haya en la superficie buenas intenciones, en el fondo es una visión profundamente racista que desprecia la capacidad de un pueblo y de su identidad nacional de echar para adelante en igual condiciones con las otras naciones del mundo.
But then the question is, what about federal funding? Because Puerto Rico gets billions of dollars from the US every year.
Es bien importante recordar que el sistema de beneficencia estadounidense, sobre todo cuando opera en el contexto colonial, está diseñado para perpetuar la pobreza. Por eso no nos puede extrañar que hay dinero para no incentivar a la gente a trabajar. Sin embargo, no aparecen recursos para desarrollo económico de Puerto Rico.
One thing that has made it very clear to some that Puerto Rico is still a colony of the US is the board that was imposed by the US on Puerto Rico to manage its finances. That's a group of members who were not elected by the Puerto Rican people, but who have recently demonstrated that they have the power to override the local elected government. They're in charge of getting Puerto Rico out of bankruptcy, but they're also responsible for cuts to things like education and pensions.
La realidad de la Junta de Control Fiscal está ayudando a que el país enfrente lo que significa vivir bajo la bota del gobierno estadounidense, sobre todo una juventud que ha crecido en la precariedad, sienten que el sistema les empuja hacia el exilio económico.
Definitivamente de aquí a un tiempo a que me gradúe no me veo lamentablemente dentro de mi isla, aunque quisiera. Es doloroso siquiera pensarlo, tener que irme.
Robin Lee wants independence for Puerto Rico.
Why would you want to be a state under an empire that has literally corrupted everything we have today? They have tried to erase our culture. They literally persecuted us when they got here. We did not receive them or invited them here to have some coffee or some galletitas. Like, they literally arrived and they started bombing us.
I met her at Casa Canales in Jayuya. That town was at the center of the uprising in the 50s, and where nationalists tried to declare Puerto Rico a free republic.
Creo que es un lugar bastante sentimental, como Pipiola.
Robin believes any other status for Puerto Rico would be risking her identity as a Puerto Rican.
Yo nací en Puerto Rico, soy puertorriqueña, y ellos quieren borrar lo que queda de nuestra puertorriqueñidad para poder incluirnos a la suya, para poder hacernos igual que ellos. Si no somos igual que ellos, no nos van a incluir. Espero que de viejita pueda tal vez decir que puedo regresar a mi isla o quedarme en mi isla y porque sea independiente.
Puerto Ricans want some kind of a relationship with the United States, either statehood or Commonwealth, or a form of Commonwealth, which they call free association.
Despite the fact that you as an individual will prefer independence for Puerto Rico, you're clear that the majority of Puerto Ricans don't want independence.
Absolutely, and that is a fact that I don't like, but I have to come to terms with it.
Emilio Pantojas Garcia is a historian who has both studied the persecution of pro-independence Puerto Ricans and lived it.
I have a file, an illegal file, that was created on me because I was for independence. And the FBI,
you have a carpeta.
A carpeta. I do have a carpeta.
But even putting all of that aside, he's aware that most Puerto Ricans are not willing to risk federal funding or the US passports for future generations.
The colony has certain advantages. The world is contradictory. And so the colony, being the most important colony of the most powerful country in the world, has its advantages, but it also has great disadvantages. And you will see, if you interview other people, the self-hate, the self-derision, because it doesn't come bluntly. I hate myself. It means, oh, I want to be an American. I want to be part of the United States. We want to be part of this. We want to be part of that. The federal funds. And so that's self-hate. That is not trusting yourself. That is colonialism in the worst expression, which is the colonialism of the soul and the mind of the people.
So, could Puerto Rico make it on its own? Independence supporters say, of course. In fact, they believe that being free from the United States means opening up to a world of possibilities.
Puerto Rico is an economically viable country. If it were to be part of a community of the Caribbean, there are sovereign countries that are small and progress. So we're not going to starve. We will need to work more, for sure, of course.
But if the majority of Puerto Ricans don't want independence, what other options are there? Well, there's something in the middle that ranges from a version of what we have today all the way to an option that would give Puerto Rico more sovereignty, and of course their statehood. I'm going to be exploring those options in the next 2 videos, so stay tuned for the next couple of weeks when I'm going to be posting that. Thank you so much for watching. I also want to thank Brandon Burkey, who helped me again with all the interviews for this video, and Edna Pabon, who edited this video. And thank you for supporting me. Remember, I have a Patreon if you want to continue to support my videos, and I'll see you soon.